So good morning, everyone. So this is the last day of our problem-solving workshop. If people are joining now or just watching the recording of the presentation, this is an activity at the Fields Institute. We've been running for the last 3 weeks. There are about 50 participants in the workshop between students, postdocs, faculty mentors, and representatives from the partner institutions. And the format of this was that there were 4 problems that were proposed at the start of the workshop 3 weeks ago, and then the groups worked tirelessly, and today we're going to see their solutions to the problems. So we're very excited, and it's a very different type of ending of an event where now we know each other very well, and we are really excited to see what's coming up. So I will start with the first group from the OECD. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Matthias, and welcome from us as well to the OECD's Problems Final Output presentation after 3 weeks of a wonderful virtual extended problem-solving workshop. We would first of all like to thank the organizers, Matthias, William, Angus, and Sarah, from the Fields Institute, as well as our supervisors for providing this platform for us to come together, learn, sleep less, and discuss issues around systemic recovery. Our group has been investigating effectiveness of policy intervention in different countries and lessons for the future. Our work is greatly inspired by an INET publication by Alvelda, Ferguson, and Mallory from November last year. Next slide, please. The snapshot of cumulative COVID-19 deaths per million people from 2 days ago puts one observation at the center. It is the heterogeneity with which countries have been affected by the virus. Some have had a tragically large number of infections and deaths, while others have had a milder development and lost less lives. Next slide. When we observe the development of countries over the past year in a dynamic weekly tracker, the heterogeneity of countries regarding losing lives and experiencing economic losses is even more prevalent. While at the beginning of the pandemic 1 year ago, there was a strong narrative which said, if we decide to save lives, we will need to sacrifice our economies via lockdowns, trade losses, and unemployment. Today, the story is a different one. The dynamic picture of how heterogeneous the dynamic has been of countries moving along the y-axis of cumulative COVID-19 death per million people, here in reversed axis, and the x-axis of economic losses as percentage of GDP, one lesson is clear. Countries that decided to save lives saved their economies too. Those countries that sacrificed lives experienced greater economic losses as well. The graph depicts the country's fiscal stimulus via the bubble size, and the colors depict countries' groupings, which will be explained in detail later on in the presentation. But in order for us to understand the journey that different countries have taken and identify which lesson to learn for collective better policies, we will provide you an analysis of understanding countries' structural characteristics, their policy choices, and how they became successful or failed examples of this pandemic, starting off with some country case studies.
Yes, thank you, Carla. Here I will explain a bit how we did this analysis of country studies. To build this time series analysis, we have used the data from the our wording data, which is new deaths by million, weekly averages. Also the weekly GDP tracker by the OECD, which captures signals from the economy taken from Google Trends, which have been greatly presented to us by Nicolas yesterday. And we also take into consideration the stringency index, which is an index that goes from 0 to 100. That is retrieved from the government response tracker of the Blavatnik School of Government and Oxford University. To draw a comparison, we also use a change in time at home compared to the baseline, which is the data provided by the Google mobility data. And with that, we can see the compliance of these stringency measures that have been adopted by governments in terms of the citizens' behavior. Today, we're going to present a couple of case studies. The first 2 ones that I'm going to introduce to you are Sweden and Norway, which represents the heterogeneity within the Scandinavian group, as Carla has mentioned in the map. these countries are neighbors, but still they got very different results in terms of at least one of our objective functions, which is deaths by million. Also, we are presenting the UK and US because they have been obviously significantly impacted by the pandemic, not very successful stories. Japan, Australia, and New Zealand that are well-known success stories in Asia and Oceania. And later on, Hungary and Czech Republic that capture well the change from one wave to the other, which is very well captured by our GIF presented by Carla previously. Next slide, please. Yes, here you can see the difference between Sweden and Norway. Both in Sweden and Norway, individuals shift their behavior, increasing the time spent at home with respect to the baseline, which is presented in the green time series there. So before the restrictions actually take place, so more restrictions is represented by darker colors in the shaded areas. Individuals start already to shift their behavior in the beginning of end of February, beginning of March, before restrictions have been actually implemented. Actually, the same thing happens with GDP that starts to drop way before deaths begin to rise and way before the containment measures have been implemented. And this is something that is even more evident when we discuss the US case that is going to be discussed by Ettore later on. As you can see, the Norwegian government has implemented from the 12th of March a strict lockdown and has obtained particularly significant results and was able to finish the first outbreak and control the pandemic, the first spread at least, arriving at a reproduction number of 0.7 in 6th of April. So in a nutshell, we see that Sweden has performed much worse than Norway, implemented not so strict containment measures and arrived at 10 times higher deaths by million of people with this first and second wave taking much longer. Later on, Sweden has indeed adopted more stringent measures, pressured by its numbers in deaths per million. I now hand over to next case study. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to talk about the well-known success story in Asia and the Oceania. As we can see, the timeline for Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And we point out some moments, the worst moment for each of them. The first, we can notice for Australia that the second wave happened after relaxed COVID-19 restrictions in May 2020, that they had the second wave. And for the New Zealand case, the worst moment was in the beginning for the number of deaths and GDP losses. And I also would like to mention for Japan that they didn't impose lockdown, only some restrictions. And then after relaxing this restriction, they had the worst outbreak after the worst outbreak. And this purple here, some fiscal stimulus that each of them did. And finally, I would like to summarize some policy interventions. Australia, they did social distance measures, shut down on essential business. They also provide payment to help workers. New Zealand, they had a border control restrictions and contract tracing, testing, and isolation of cases in quarantine. And they also provide the social financial support, and they have this universal coverage. For the Japan case, they have easy adoption of protective measures, is hand washing, physical distance, and wear of masks that were already part of the Japanese culture. Thank you.
So I will now discuss briefly the case of the US and the UK, which, as Maria mentioned, are undoubtedly unsuccessful cases for our analysis. And so first of all, one thing that we can confirm that is also already discussed in the literature, in particular by Chetty, that does a more granular and county level analysis on US data. That is that changes in consumer behavior during the pandemic and could be already observed in the beginning of March, that is, basically half a month before the introduction of government-imposed restrictions. And this can be quite easily observed at the beginning of our series in March 2020. So the US, I think, it's particularly interested because even though the measures put in place by the US government at the beginning of the pandemic were kind of tardy, still the households and people self-imposed containment measures by restricting consumption. So this is an important case for paying attention not only to government-imposed containment measures, but also to self-imposed measures. And in particular, as we can see in the US, government restrictions added to pre-existing shifts in consumer behavior. For instance, people deciding not to go to restaurants for fear or similar or health concerns, and thus government restrictions and strengthen the negative spillovers already pre-existing. Another aspect that I want to stress is the interlinkages between GDP losses as measured with our OECD tracker and new deaths per million. In particular, we can see that the two go hand in hand during the first wave. And, in an epidemiological sense, the first wave was never really dissipated in the US because it reached a plateau that then led to a second wave. But after the first wave, actually, GDP losses went, reduced and followed the negative trend, while we know that the US were hit hard by the second wave as well. Another aspect regards the seasonalities, bearing in mind that our series are not seasonally adjusted, then we can see that if we move to the second graph in terms of time at home, there are some significantly seasonal changes in the series, which are correspond to an increase basically in a spike in time at home during Thanksgiving and Christmas. And most importantly, there is no clear relation. Just to mention that our series do not take into account also stimulus policies. So, in particular, after in the last months, we should bear in mind that our GDP losses could be much. The blue line in our graph could look much worse. Given if we take out stimulus. And the last point for the US that I think it's it's a simple stylized fact is that there is no clear relation between stringency and time at home, and this has to do both with the characteristics of the United States as a federal state, as a union of federal states, so that probably measures were more restrictive in New York and less restrictive in Texas. But one way or the other, we cannot establish a clear relation between the stringency and time at home. And I think this is another aspect to stress. Next slide, please. For the UK, we see some similar patterns. And in particular, something that I want to highlight is the spike in the time at home during beginning, end of 2020, beginning of 2021, and this was. It's difficult to say that this was caused by an increase in stringency, which was mild. It has probably to do with the fear that people had of the UK variant spreading out. So this is another evidence in favor of the fact that self-imposed restrictions probably matter more than government-imposed ones. And another aspect of, after something that we can fairly say was an unsuccessful policy reaction by the UK government, we can also look at to some degree at the success of UK compared to neighboring European countries in the effect of vaccination, which I think that contributed quite substantially to lower the death curve after the second wave. Similarly to the US, stringency and Google data mobility are not always consistent with each other, as we see from the second graph. But even though the stringency measures were not so strong during summer, we can see that British population remained at home relatively more compared with neighboring European countries. And the really last aspect that I want to stress is the persistency of GDP losses compared to the US and compared also to other European countries. We can see that even after the first wave, the UK really didn't recover all the losses and still experience on a weekly basis some significantly positive losses. And I'm gonna stop here. Over to you.
Thank you. After talking about the States and the UK's examples, let me draw your kind attention to Hungary and Czech Republic. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So Hungary and Czech Republic are small countries. Both of them are poor in remote areas. And the population of these two countries are around 10 million each. None of them is threatened by immediate bankruptcy or climate tragedy. So why it is still worth paying attention to what is going on here? Why these countries are important? Because we state that the cases of these countries are very important. The reason is that these two countries of Central Europe are experiencing a dreadful third waves of the coronavirus. In this figure, you can see the first and second and the third waves with gray areas. Let me just introduce new figures in order to present our preliminary results. So in this slide, you can see the blue and the red line with the new cases, which occurred in a single week. The dotted lines with red and blue colors, you can see the total amount of death correlated to the coronavirus. You can see that in the first wave, the first wave passed like a miracle because it is almost nothing happened with regards to the coronavirus. The coronavirus almost missed to hit these two countries. Due to lack of time, I would like to only focus on the measures implemented in Hungary during the first wave. So the beginning of March, there was a declaration of state of danger. During the same month, the Hungarian parliament adopted a law which was focusing on the containment of the coronavirus. This month's mandatory shelter in place was adopted. But the restrictions started to begin to be lifted in early May, and from June, the state of danger was ended. In Hungary, during the second wave, there was a mandatory shelter took in place in November, but before November, almost nothing happened. So many people started to get the virus. And in the third wave, you can see an immense amount of the new cases and also tragic data on the number of deaths. Please go to the next slide. One of our statements is that these two countries, the policymakers became overconfident. They thought that since the first wave almost hasn't hit these countries, that the policy measures which were introduced were enough and sufficient. In these slides, you can see the cases of Hungary and the Czech Republic on different figures. In the Hungary's slide, you can see that there are 3 measures with dotted lines, and the policy ceiling is also highlighted. during the first wave, as I mentioned before, immediate actions were taken into account by the government. So almost everything reached the roof, the severity. But later, the measures started to be less and less severe. Let me draw your attention to the green dotted lines. You can see that that is with reference for the protection of the elderly people. The huge number of the deaths is related, is coming from the old age people. And you can see that between September and November, their defense went to the normalized minimum value. And my last sentences are going to talk about the Czech Republic. You can see that their policy followed the same pattern that in Hungary. So they started with the maximum level of the policy measures, and then they started to increase their severity. But regarding the elderly people and the school measures, they introduced very, very severe measures from the beginning of the second wave. However, as you can see, in many aspects of the Czech pandemic responses have failed. Maybe from the poorly performing and vastly expensive test and tracing program, and also the ventilator purchase. And also, I think that the ill-judged timing of the lockdowns was a huge policy error. And I would like to finalize by a question. What these countries made wrong? Could have them find another way? Thank you.
So thank you, Adam. And let me stress that this presentation was made possible by the collective effort of everyone in the group. So this brings from the individual cases to the most quantitative part of our analysis. Here we developed the research question by looking at countries' performances during the COVID-19 pandemic up to the Q1 2021. So we are asking to ourselves, could some countries have done better, and what determines their health and economic performances? We have decomposed this question into, let's say, sub-questions. One is about the role of COVID-19 policies. Is this success or failure entirely due to the policies, or there is something else? What are the most relevant policies? And the second element is the role of countries' structural characteristics. So are there specific factors at the country level that affect success or failure? What are these factors, and how do they affect the effectiveness of policies? To tackle this research question, we went for an approach based on clustering analysis first. So we group countries based on health and economic outcomes, or on structural characteristics, or on policies to identify success and failure stories. Then we visualize the relationship we have found from clustering in these Sankey diagrams that helps to understand what's going on. And finally, we do an econometric analysis to assess what are the most relevant factors for the success and failure of the stories. So this is what we are going to present in the next slides. So next, please. The data set we have collected is covers 46 countries from different sources. This is a snapshot at Q1 2021. We have data from our wording data about the total deaths per million, economic losses decomposing quarterly GDP from the OECD tracker, stimulus data from IMF. Then we have some variables about policy. This can be about containment and health measures, like the government response tracker of Oxford University, stimulus data, or Google community mobility data for understanding the time spent at home and outside. And finally, we have some data about structural characteristics that include the world development indicators, other data from our wording data, so various sources, and then we have something about international trade that allows us to compute country centralities in the trade network. Next, please. Okay, I'll be very brief here. So the methodology we are employing to find cluster is hierarchical agglomerative clustering. I not have time to explain in the detail what is. I just want to say that we are clustering on 3 objects. So the first one is clustering on health and losses outcomes of countries. That is the way in which build the figure at the beginning of the presentation. Then we cluster on the country structural characteristics, and then we cluster on the policies put in place for facing COVID-19. So next slide, please. The first type of clustering is on structural characteristics. So here we included several kinds of variables. This can be broadly grouped into categories like demographic, social and economic variables, and health related variables. So for instance, the previous exposure to SARS epidemics is an health related variable. So we put all these variables together, we run the clustering, and the clustering algorithm is finding the similarity across countries given these characteristics. We identify 7 countries by balancing between being parsimonious and being detailed. So 7 countries can represent more or less a good explanation. In these clusters, there are 3 that are quite easy to understand. They are cluster 2, 3, and 4. So cluster 2 is made of Latin American country plus some emerging economy. Then we have cluster 3 with South European countries, Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal. And then we have cluster 4 that is made by countries that were part of the former Soviet Union. Moreover, if you look at cluster 1, you can find that there is Sweden and Norway. As Maria was mentioning, these 2 countries are very similar, so they have been identified by the algorithm in cluster 1. To the right, you see the dendrogram, that is the way in which clustering is represented. We choose to cut the dendrogram at this level where you see the colors. But if you want to be more parsimonious, you can cut it to the right, and you get less clusters, basically. So let's go to the next slide about clustering on outcomes. So here, the variables for clustering were the variables that you can see on the axis. On one axis, the horizontal one, you have economic losses. That is GDP losses plus the fiscal stimulus over the GDP in 2019. This is a percentage. And on the vertical axis, you have the COVID-19 deaths per million of people. So the result of the clustering algorithm is these 4 groups. So you have 2 groups that did well, the blue one and the red one. And then you have the blue and the green one. Then you have the red group that is in the middle, so is an intermediate group, and there are a couple of outliers due to our choice about the level of clustering. So Israel and Czech Republic are outliers here. If we go more granular, we can distinguish between these countries. And then there is this gray group that is made by US and UK, that are those that are not performing well during the COVID. Okay, so we are basing the rest of the presentation of these 4 groups. So let's move on to the next clustering, that is the last one I'm explaining. This is clustering on policies, in particular on policy to contain COVID. Here we try to be very parsimonious, and we just picked 5 characteristics, 5 features that are the variables to the left. So these are from C1 to RECID, that are school closures, testing, tracing, facial coverings, and RECID, that is the time spent at home. You can see these variables on the horizontal axis of the plots here. And the plots represent the clusters, the way in which the algorithm has classified countries. So the most relevant thing about this slide is that probably testing and tracing, when done together, contribute to explain the success stories. If you have a look to cluster 6, you look at H2 and H3, you see that these countries put in place strong testing and tracing policy, and all these countries that are in yellow, highlighted in yellow, are those that are in the successful groups. So can be in the green or in the blue group. You can see something similar even in the cluster 2. H3, that is tracing, is very high. This is normalized to 0.1 anyway. And also testing is above the 0.5. So some of these countries also are above, among the best. Of course, this clustering is not telling you everything, and it's difficult to draw some inference from this. Last thing to notice about the clustering algorithm is that it seems that some countries that couldn't put in place strong testing and tracing compensated by increasing the time spent at home, that is this variable resid. So probably they increased the restriction about mobility because they cannot do proper tracing or enough tests for COVID. Okay, so this was my last slide. Now I'm leaving the deck to Enrico for Sankey.
Yeah, thanks, Ettore. I'm going to show you the Sankey diagram. To do that, I have to momentarily quit the PowerPoint presentation to show you these interactive plots. So the Sankey diagrams is a plot that provides a visual representation of all the possible connections that take place between clusters of countries based on selected variables, that is structural characteristics, policies, and outcomes. And this plot gives us an idea of whether successful or failure countries did well or bad because starting with similar characteristics, or because they adopted similar policies, or a combination of the two. So the first figure I'm going to show you presents on the left the list of all countries that we analyze. In the middle, the clusters of the cluster of countries based on structural characteristics, on the right, the clusters of countries based on the outcomes. And so we can see from the diagram, so starting from the cluster of countries in outcome 1, that is a successful story, we can see that most of the countries in the outcome 1 belongs to the cluster of the structural characteristics 1. So basically, and these are in fact the well-known successful story, like as you can see, as Australia, Finland, Denmark, and Norway, New Zealand, and so on. While there are for instance, countries belonging to a different structure clusters, such as structure 5 and structure 3, that so none of these countries ended up in the outcome 1. While if we're looking, for instance, the failure stories, that is countries in the outcome 4, we see that most of the countries basically belong to the structure 2 and structure 4. These are basically the Latin American countries, and these are the Eastern European or post-socialist countries. Also, by looking at this graph, however, we can notice some interesting counterintuitive pattern. For instance, by focusing on this cluster of countries with these specific characteristics, we see that most of the countries ended up in outcome 4, but there are a couple of countries that ended up in outcome 1. So a successful story, despite starting with similar characteristics. And these are in particular Russia and Estonia. In particular, the latter case is particularly interesting in our view, because we know that Estonia implemented very strong digital strategies against COVID-19 and allowing for electronic voting and providing electronic devices for homeschooling, and eventually perform way better than similar countries, starting with similar characteristics. So, but we can better grasp these aspects once we include the policy dimension in this diagram. As you can see in this figure, and because we know that the countries also with similar characteristics adopt very different policies and resulting in very different outcomes. Starting again from the successful story, these countries in outcome 1, we can see that most of the countries belong to the cluster policy 6 and 7. This is the set of policy which so the cluster of countries that massively that made massive use of testing and tracing, as Andrea just described, and we can say that most of all the countries in that adopted policy 6 belongs to the structure 1 and structure 7. So this seems to be the best combination of structural characteristics and policy, leading to the best outcomes in terms of low deaths and low economic losses. Then we can, okay, if I want to point out just a couple of things more. So if we do the opposite exercise, so going from the structural characteristic to policy, we're focusing on this group, we see that which is basically corresponds to the successful story like Austria, Deutschland, France, Japan, Korea. We see that so most of these countries in this cluster of structural characteristics indeed not implemented the same policy 6. However, there are a couple of exceptions. One of this is this case, that is Japan. It's not clear from this diagram, but I checked the data. And so Japan started with similar characteristics of the other countries, adopted different policies, and again, by looking at the data, we eventually see that Japan did well anyway, and ending up in the outcome 2. While the other case of exception is this case that is France, which again started with similar characteristics but adopted a very different policy, and it ended up in outcome 4, is the failure story. So basically, what we can say is that so France, despite having similar characteristics to successful countries, adopted very different policies, resulting in very bad outcomes, meaning that if France had adopted the same policy of very similar countries, would have experienced much better performance. There are plenty of stories that can be extrapolated from this diagram, but for reason of time, I prefer to stop here and give the floor to Gallo.
Okay, so far we gathered lots of interesting variables in our data set. Okay, and of course we want to analyze the data set systematically. One way to do that is, of course, by conducting regression analysis. Okay, so our goal of the regression analysis is very simple. We want to find variables that matters the most in determining a country's outcome. Okay, so originally the group decided to use a logistic model. But the problem is that we have too many variables relative to the number of observations, which produces perfectly determined results. And of course, we don't want to drop the variables because that go against our original intention. As a result, we decided to use a linear probability model instead. But we know this is going to violate OLS assumptions. So therefore, as a robustness check, we run logistic regression again on significant variables from the linear model results. We also use a loss of model selection to select variables to ensure our results are robust. Okay, next please. So let me quickly go through this timeline story of the regression analysis. So a country starts with a set of initial conditions. So fixed endowment factors, these variables are difficult to change within 1 to 2 years time during COVID, okay? And then COVID shock hits the economy. Policymakers start to make a series of policy interventions with group policies by COVID policy, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. Okay, and they all support each other. But for this regression analysis, we only use fixed endowment factors, COVID policy, and fiscal policies. Okay, and as the group showed, we done some clustering analysis. We grouped countries into 4 outcomes. Okay, and the strategy is very simple. We will regress each of the outcome over initial conditions and policy interventions. Next, please. So very quickly, just to show you what the outcomes look at on this map. As you can see, majority of the countries in Asia ended up in the success group, blue group, and the life of economy, green group, okay, with a few exceptions, Canada and Germany, okay? And the majority of the South American countries and European countries ended up in the red mixed group. We have 2 failure group countries, one is US, one is Great Britain. Okay, next. Okay, so here is our regression results. Okay, so here we've just focused on policy recommendations. Okay, so the first initial condition to look out for is past pandemic experience. So the results show some countries did learn from past experience, some did not. Okay, so for instance, let's take Canada as example. Canada suffered from SARS, okay, but they did well in H1N1, but they did well again in COVID in terms of saving lives. Okay, but this is not true for countries in the black group, for instance, UK and US. Okay, so they suffered from H1N1, but unfortunately they did badly again for COVID in terms of saving lives and saving the economy. But here, I think one important takeaway is that it's not just about the government, it's about individuals. We controlled for policy interventions, we controlled for initial conditions, but we did not control for individual behavior. Okay, so individuals probably also did not learn from the past experience for the black group, for instance. The second important takeaway we need to talk about is the vulnerable group. Okay, so a country with higher population in the vulnerable group are less likely to be successful. Okay, so this is just suggesting that as a government, you should really think about forming policies based on your vulnerable group. Okay, in terms of your fiscal policy, in terms of your COVID policies. Okay, and these vulnerable groups are, for instance, low income, elderly, and diabetic group based on our regression results. And finally, countries rely heavily on trade are less likely to be successful. This is very simple and intuitive. Trade will increase transmission risks. Okay, so countries who rely on trade should really think about how to reduce transmission risks through trade. Next, please. So here we show the second half of our regression results. So surprisingly, we have a single most important policy measure, and that's testing. Okay, so control for initial conditions, control for policy measures. Testing is very significant in terms of determining a country's outcome. So countries implemented more testing since the beginning of COVID, on average, are more likely to be successful. Okay, so what is the theory behind this? Well, more testing means more COVID information available to the government. Therefore, enable government to make better policy decisions judged by outcome. And another theory is that more testing means people who tested positive will stay self-isolate, so stop the virus from spreading. Okay, and I think one important thing to mention is that we do not have vaccination in our regression. So I think in the future, if we do this regression again with vaccination, perhaps vaccination is equally important, but without considering vaccination, at the moment, testing is the most important policy measure. Okay, next, please. Okay, so the first robustness check we did, we ran a logistic regression using the significant variables from the linear model results. And we found the majority of the variables are still very significant, okay? And the conclusion on testing and low income group are very robust. Next. And finally, we use this lasso model selection. We run it on about 30 variables for 4 different outcome variables. So the machine learning results is pretty much consistent with our selection of the variables. Okay, we picked the variables by theory, but the machine learning selection also support our results. So this is just showing that our variable selection is very robust, therefore making our results very robust. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. At this point, let me take 3 minutes to take stock and present what we consider we have learned from our case studies and empirical analysis, and to provide with what we believe are a set of preliminary policy recommendations that come out of it. As fantastically shown through our amazing dynamic bubble graph, it is clear that the idea of a trade-off between life and livelihoods is false. In general, COVID deaths and economic losses go hand by hand. Thus, the goal is lives and livelihoods. And as such, both economic policies and health policies are complements. They should be seen as complements and not as rivals. Second, our exercises show that structural characteristics matter for both outcomes and also for the policy menu countries can choose. For example, our Sankey diagrams show that countries in some pre-COVID structures selected a reduced number of policy clusterings. This means that when choosing policy to address COVID, countries can learn from others, but they have to adapt policies to their own realities. What works in New Zealand doesn't necessarily work in Brazil. So the key here is adapt, not import. Having said that, from our cluster analysis and our regression exercise, it's clear that testing and contact tracing do come out as a more effective policy, in particular over containment measures. The challenge then it is to implement these policies effectively in settings, for example, where citizens are less inclined to share private information, which has been identified as a key feature of why contact tracing is failing in some Western countries. Additionally, from our case study of Hungary and Czech Republic, we know that we are running a marathon. This is not a 100-meter race. Though early success doesn't assure future success. Countries cannot get complacent. Now, thinking forward in terms of better preparation, COVID has underscored that micro vulnerabilities can turn into macro fragility. Which we mean by this is that variables that usually are related to vulnerability at the individual level, such as poverty and inequality, make addressing pandemics more challenging. Therefore, policies that reduce individual level fragility have also the positive externality of making the system as a whole more resilient. Additionally, it is important that people in government are good students. As just mentioned by Jason, previous exposure to SARS is related to better COVID performance. However, the lessons have to be learned. Countries should spend time analyzing what worked and what didn't work in their own context, and they also should provide public campaigns such that people understand what worked and what didn't. Finally, as discussed in the group, if we expand our understanding of COVID from an exogenous to an endogenous shock of our current global economic and social system, then pandemic prevention policies should include measures and discussions about deforestation, biodiversity, food poverty, and similar. We need to see our social economic system together with our ecological system. A broader understanding of how our way of life affects the planet and vice versa, we believe is a step forward in improving the resilience of a planet against future shocks. Next slide, Enrico, please. And just to end, of course, this is a preliminary analysis, as William mentioned at the beginning. COVID is still rampant. We have the case of India, and to give you some figures, 55 countries have experienced more deaths just in 2021 than in all 2020. Also, we haven't analyzed yet how the timing of policies affect their effectiveness. We believe it does, and we plan to include this analysis in our future paper. Some important questions for future research that are not in the scope of this exercise remain open, but we acknowledge that they are relevant. For example, what is the role of vaccinations in countries' performance against COVID? What is the effect of global supply chains in resilience as well as in vaccination supply? Finally, how does the adaptability of people to live with the virus, people being less afraid of it, affect policy in its effectiveness in time? So that's about it. Thank you very much. We want to thank everyone, especially Alan, William, and Matheus for their support and great discussions. Of course, comments are more than welcome.
Thank you so much, Group 1. This was a fantastic opening of today's presentation. So applause all around. And we have some time for questions and discussions from the rest of the groups and participants in the workshop. So either raise your hands or unmute if you want to make a remark or question. don't be shy. We have 8 minutes until the next presentation starts. Maybe William want to
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matthias, and thanks very much to the presenters. I think you did a fantastic job. And a lot of what you came up with, I think, does square with some of the discussions we've been having in OECD, but I think you came up with quite fresh and new insights into a lot of these issues. First point I'd make is that since the global financial crisis, the OECD, we moved away from the idea that it's just economic growth or productivity, that these economic variables are the only ones we should design policy around. And we've moved more in the direction of thinking about trade-offs between growth and sustainability, and how these trade-offs can be managed. But as you mentioned in your study, there is often no trade-off. Saving lives save the economy, just like improving the environment. It's probably not going to be a cost to the economy, but it might actually help the economy. So I think that was very useful. I really like the ways in which you put together the data and presented in a way which told a very clear story about the good performers and those that did less well. I also thought the clustering and structural characteristics was really important, but also that these structural characteristics were not destiny, that there were policy approaches you could take, and countries within certain clusters that actually outperformed, like Estonia, doing better because of perhaps digitalization. And the fact that this crisis and the response has probably accelerated these types of existing shifts towards digitalization and structural change in our economies. The success stories of tests and tracing, I think, is also very valuable. And your conclusions were more or less aligned with the type of framework we use in the OECD for improving resilience. This is plan and prepare, which you mentioned some ideas there. Absorb the shock when it occurs, which is related to these reactive measures you talked about. And then adapt and recover. It's the adaptability of individuals, but also these broader societal questions of social organization, cultural factors, institutions that you mentioned. And often these are seen as minor considerations in the economy, but of course, as you've showed, these actually make up the economy and they're a crucial part of how we respond and adapt to shocks. So thanks very much.
So what I'm hearing is that the OECD can hire all of the participants in the group, right? That's the upshot.
I think you could conclude that.
Yes. Mark.
I had maybe a sort of comment about something that William has said, which is, that it seems like the evidence shows that there isn't necessarily a trade-off between the economy and health. But I think there are trade-offs that weren't necessarily covered there. For example, the effectiveness of test and trace has a trade-off in that the most effective tracing policies typically involve a certain invasion of individual privacy. And I think the comparison between how we handle contact tracing in Canada versus the sort of big success story in South Korea. In Canada, it was very voluntary. Essentially, if you tested positive, you were called by a call center that were very, would have difficulty dealing with surge anyway, but they also really demanded cooperation from the public to willingly share information. Whereas in Korea, they used laws that essentially gave up a lot of private information of citizens, maybe not their name, but there was a registry online where for every positive case, you could, based on their credit card and transit pass transactions, you could have a detailed record of where that person was. And so there is possibly a trade-off there, and in that maybe a good question is how can we, knowing that test and tracing is very effective, can we have that system in place without that trade-off, which maybe wasn't discussed in the economic sense, but does involve the states encroaching on people's private information and private lives in a fairly meaningful way?
Thank you, Mark. And that's similar to what happens in financial stability and financial regulation. It's been known for a while that the more information that can be shared by the institutions, the more stable, but then how can this be done in a safe and private way? Tom.
Yeah, I was struck, I'm always struck by the differences between the first and the second waves. It's almost as though they're two completely different runs of parallel but not the same thing. And so I noticed that the policy, it gets muddied. The policy recommendations gets muddied because what worked in the first wave clearly didn't work in the second wave. and vice versa. So the outcomes are so different between the first and second waves. Did you consider what would happen hypothetically if you ran the first wave, all of your analysis for the first wave, and then did exactly a similar analysis for the second wave? Since they're so clearly separated by the summer months, it would be very interesting to see which policies actually are most effective in the first wave as opposed to what worked in the second wave. And in particular, contact tracing is very effective when the case numbers are small, but the second wave, the case numbers were not small. And so contact tracing, I think, was much less effective in the second wave than in the first wave. So I wonder if you would do the analysis separately for the first two waves and compare and contrast those differences.
I think that's a great suggestion, and they still have time to prepare the paper for submission at the end of the summer, so they should be following that. It's very good, and they're also going to consider sort of time-dependent policies. Here, the policies were just like an overall look at during the entire period, but they can look at the sort of sequence in which policies were implemented. That's part of the analysis yet to come. I'm answering on behalf of the group just in the interest of time, but Alan.
Yeah, okay. First of all, let me thank these people who spent many afternoons with you people, and I learned a lot, and I think it was really a very good experience. But let me just make one remark about what Tom was saying. There is a double problem. Not only were things happening, but people were learning as well. So on the one hand, you have the policymakers who are learning from what's happened. They start to understand what they should or shouldn't have done. And on the other hand, the virus itself is also learning. So you're getting mutations appearing, which also had quite a big impact. Where they hit and which countries were affected by them will also make a big difference between first and second and even third waves. So I think it's going to be a complicated exercise to do what Tom said, simply because the dynamic environment is changing all the time. But it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and look at what they did in 3 weeks. Imagine what they can do in the next 4 months if they just keep working like that. So we take one final question from Hipod, a new visitor, I believe.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for presentation. It was wonderful. I just wonder about the similar works, because I've read papers at least with very similar title. I was wondering if any of you can give a little bit of history of other works that came up with the same conclusion. I can at least share one of them in the chat box. So, but anyhow, that would be wonderful if you share the other works with the same conclusion, and we can compare the methods that you guys have used and them have used.
Yeah. And sorry, again, answering on behalf of the group. So yes, they did look at many similar analyses, and that will be part of the reference and the literature review in the paper that is coming up. But yes, they couldn't review everything that they had read. The focus today was on the marginal, or not marginal, the extra contribution that they did to this literature. So with that, because we still have 3 fantastic presentations to go, so let me transition to, so thank you very much again to group 1, absolutely great. And